So welcome everyone. Today we have a talk by Fangyu Liu. He's a second-year PhD student in the NLP lab in the Language Technology Lab in Cambridge, in the University of Cambridge, supervised by Professor Nigel Collier. His research centers around multimodal NLP, self-supervised representation learning, and model interpretability. Today he will present a talk, as you can see, entitled Learning Text Representation from Pre-trained Language Models via Contrastive Learning and Self-Distillation. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Hector. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's a great pleasure to share our recent work. The title is Learning Text Representations from Pre-trained Language Models. And the technique used would be contrastive learning and self-distillation. So I'm trying to squeeze 2 works into just this one talk. The first would be using the contrastive learning technique. And based on the first work, we proposed transencoder, which is the second work accepted to ICLR 2022 based on self-distillation. The first work is done with collaborators from Cambridge, and the second work is done with collaborators from Amazon, including Yunlong, who is here today. So I will start with the first work, again, please feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have any questions. And I think if you put the question in the chat, Hector can read that, because I probably couldn't see your chat while I'm presenting. Okay, I will start with the first work. It's called Fast, Effective, and Self-Supervised, Transforming Mass Language Models into Universal Lexical and Sentence Encoders. I realize that this title is way too long, but if I were to name this work now, this paper basically presents a method to turn a pre-trained language model into a very good sentence or simply text encoder. Because it's probably counterintuitive that in natural language processing, given this kind of pre-trained language model, just off the shelf, they are quite bad at producing features. This is different in the computer vision domain, where you have a ResNet 50, you chop the classification head, and whatever you get is actually a very good image feature extractor. However, in BERT, it turns out that if you just extract the features from BERT, it's very likely that the model's performance is going to be quite bad. So this work is really to propose a kind of a post-adjustment for this kind of pre-trained language model to convert them from a pre-trained language model into a good text encoder, which can be used off the shelf in a zero-shot way. Yeah, that's the motivation I mentioned. We did this work mainly because off-the-shelf pre-trained language models are not reasonably good text encoders. And we wanted to fix this. This is some of the evidence we have at hand. The whole sentence or text similarity community sort of is very focused on this sentence similarity task, or its abbreviation is STS. The task is basically given to sentences. Your model needs to give it a similarity score, and hopefully your model's prediction could correlate with human's prediction of the correlation of 2 sentences. So the performance is measured by Spearman rank coefficient. And as you can see, if we take BERT just off the shelf to do this task, it turns out that it's worse than GLOV word embeddings. GLOV is like the very basic baseline for word embeddings for representing text. So if given a sentence, we simply average all the word embeddings in that sentence, it will give us a much better performance comparing to extracting such embeddings from BERT. So I tried two types of feature extraction from BERT here. One called BERT MT, which is mean pooling the all the token representations of the last layer, or we take the COS token, which is the first token of the BERT's last layer. And both of them perform quite miserably. What did people do before to try to fix this? So there was this famous work called Sentence BERT or SBERT from EMLP 2019 that they tried to fine-tune BERT's model on some downstream applications, such that after fine-tuning, the BERT's sentence representation could be greatly enhanced. The task they chose mainly is NOI, which is natural language inference. And the construction of the data set is like what you have on the right-hand side, where given two sentences, the model needs to judge whether they are contradictory to each other, whether they are neutral to each other, or one entails the other. So it's a three-way classification problem. The way Sentence BERT model this is that they input sentence A and sentence B separately to the BERT model. Note that these two BERT models share weights, so it's essentially the same model. So it's this two-tower or dual encoder structure they have, and they input sentence pairs to the model, get two embeddings, U and V. Then based on these two embeddings, they will perform a three-way classification. So it turns out that after this fine-tuning process, BERT becomes much better than before on representing sentences. So the sentence BERT, we call it SBERT here, outperforms all the BERT models before and outperforms law of word embeddings by a very large margin. So this kind of Siamese dual encoder fine-tuning really saves BERT. However, you could imagine that there is some kind of drawback on this kind of method because it requires annotated data or some sort of downstream applications to fine-tune the model. So they used natural language inference data, but it's not available in every language, and also in some specific domains like say biomedical domain text. You don't have that kind of data set for you to fine-tune the model on. So it would be really fascinating if we can come up with some kind of data efficient or even zero-shot way to achieve this kind of adaptation. So our paper tried to answer the question, can we completely get rid of the supervision signals, which was a NOI in the sentence BERT case. We know this can't be done in computer vision. In computer vision, self-supervised learning, it's quite common to apply this kind of data augmentation techniques on one image to create separate views of the same image. And the learning objective is simply to maximize the similarity of images originated from the same original image. And but can we simply do the same thing for language? Is there any problem we need to be conscious about? So we think we can, but we need to make some assumptions before we do this, because text data augmentation is completely different from visual data augmentation. It's very hard to crop a sentence while still preserve its semantics. While for images, if you crop a part of it, it's still quite straightforward for one to tell whether this is a dog or a cat. But for sentences, it's usually quite long, and sometimes the information is concentrated on 2 or 3 words. If you happen to crop those 2 or 3 words out, it could be hard for you to reconstruct the whole sentences. So anyways, we probably need to be cautious about what kind of data augmentation we do. So here is our assumptions. First, we assume that if we randomly mask just a tiny part of a text given, this should not change the semantics of the text by too much. And because for human brains, we can easily reconstruct a corrupted text based on its context. But the key is that the mask part couldn't be too long, otherwise it would damage the semantics stored in that sentence. So in this example sentence, econ mask Paul Krugman mainly works on trade models. So we human beings could probably guess what's being masked. It should be economist, because Paul Krugman is an economist. Even if we don't have that background knowledge, we know that he works on trade models, so he probably is an economist. So yeah, that's our first assumption. It's a quite simple and quite basic one, but empirically we found that this works quite well, and comparing to other more sophisticated data augmentations, this seems to be quite robust. We will come back to this in experiments later. The second assumption we make is not in the input space, but in the embedding space. We assume that in vectorized distributed text representations, if we erase or change a small set of elements of the vector, its meaning shouldn't be changed too much. This is easy to understand because based on the distributed representation theory, information should be stored evenly across different elements in a vector. And hopefully the missing vectors could be reconstructed by elements of other elements in other positions. So based on the two assumptions, we proposed two types of data augmentation techniques for text models. The first, we call it random span masking. It's data augmentation on the input space. Specifically given a sentence like X1, we simply randomly mask a span of fixed length and replace it with the mask token, which is quite typical for a BERT model to have. And we ask the model to maximize the similarity of these two sentences because they are considered a positive pair in contrastive learning, which we will mention later. And this is data augmentation on the input space, but for the second assumption we made, it's in the embedding space. So we propose to just use dropouts. And the idea is that given the same embedding, if we input to the BERT model twice, given the same text sequence, if we input it to the BERT model twice, during training time, their outputs would actually be slightly different because the dropout masks will be independent. And this gives us some freedom of applying data augmentation because this is inherent to BERT models. We don't need to implement anything. Transformer blocks themselves have dropout layers. So as long as we do this kind of dual encoder architecture, automatically dropout will be there to apply feature space data augmentation. Yeah, we just leverage this, and this will be our second type of data augmentation. As simple as that, with just two types of data augmentation, we will start with our experiment. But just before, I just wanted to briefly show this high-level architecture again. So given X1, which is probably a sentence, we first apply random span masking. And this is just optionally because I see there's someone saying something in the chat. I couldn't see the content, so Hector, if it's a question, please let me know.
No, sorry. That was only me saying that people can ask questions in the chat. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sounds good. So we have X1 and X1 bar, which is the augmented version of X1. But this random span masking is optional because in some experiments, we dealt with a shorter text, which would be too short for input-based data augmentation. So we simply duplicated X1 in those cases. There is another very famous work called SIM-CSE, which use exactly identical sentence pairs for this kind of contrastive learning. So if we just disregard this random span masking, you could consider that our work is almost identical to CMCSE. So given X1 and X1 bar, we input them to the same BERT model because these two models actually share weights. And there will be multiple dropout layers in the BERT models. So their hidden representations will be slightly altered, and that's independently. And we will get two embeddings, fx1 and fx1 bar. And we simultaneously in the embedding space, we will have embeddings produced from other sentences sampled elsewhere. And our learning objective would simply be maximizing the similarity between the positive pair and push away all the negative pairs. And here is our learning objective. It's a standard info in CE, which you see everywhere in contrastive learning. And the blue term is the similarity of the positive pair, and the red term is the sum of all pairs in the mini batch. So this loss simply achieves the objective we just mentioned. So how does this perform? This sounds really just basic and very unsophisticated, but it turns out that it performs really well. By the way, we call our model MirrorBERT, so that's the model on the right-hand side. It performs almost as well as SentenceBERT, which is trained with supervised learning data from natural language inference. But for MirrorBERT, we were using identical sentences as input. So we could randomly sample these kind of sentences anywhere in the wild. So we could use Wikipedia, for example, or any data, individual sentence data could be sufficient. And it's quite surprising to us that without access to any kind of training data, it's performing as well as SentenceBERT. And this actually opens up a lot of new avenues for us because SentenceBERT is applied in the general domain, which we have sentences and it's in the general domain. So it's a very standard setup, but in real world applications, text is not just sentences. Sometimes you need to represent text on the level of words, sometimes on the level of phrase, and sometimes you need to represent text in another domain, like the biomedical domain, social media domain. And sometimes you need to represent text in other languages. SentenceBERT was in English, but sometimes you need Hebrew model, Italian model, so on and so forth. So to achieve all these, you cannot have access to supervised learning data. So if you achieve if you apply our method, you could achieve similar performance comparing to SentenceBERT. That's quite appealing, in my opinion. And this whole slide shows that the spectrum of experiments we did, and we observed a similar phenomenon across all these setups. So I just wanted to very briefly show here that to cover the whole results we have, because I think it's actually the interpretation of the work that's more interesting. Which is what I will talk about in the next probably 5 minutes. So why has this worked? That's really the present question we wanted to answer, and we have some analysis and interpretations of our own. So we think the key to this question is the so-called anisotropy of BERT. From this Yamada 2019 paper, as Isayara said this in the paper, in all layers of BERT, ELMO, and GPT-2, the representations of all words are anisotropic, which means these data points occupy a narrow cone in the embedding space instead of being distributed throughout. So that means that if you try to use BERT to embed any types of text, it's usually the case that whatever text you input to the model, their embeddings look insanely similar to each other. For example, for GPT-2, it's on average the cosine similarity of any input text would be above 99%. So this is a problem caused by the training objectives of these language models, which we will mention later on. And we believe that this is the main issue we need to address. And this is probably what the Mirror-Bird method has addressed to achieve very good performance. This is just one slice of the evidence. If you look at the left-hand side figure, we just randomly sampled some positive and negative sentence pairs from a labeled dataset called Quora question paraphrase dataset. So before training, Bird's model outputs positive and negative pairs with all very high cosine similarity, with a very significant part overlap between the two sets. However, after Mirror-Bird training, on the right-hand side, you can see that both the positive and negative pairs cosine similarity decreased, and the positive-negative pair overlap is reduced. And we also offered quantitative analysis. In terms of this, we defined an isotropic score, which was proposed by previous work. Basically, if this score goes higher, the space becomes more isotropic, which is the opposite of anisotropic, which means that the data points will be more evenly distributed in the embedding space. And we see that on both word and phrase and also sentence level, after applying Mirror-Bird, the space becomes more isotropic. And if we wanted to have a more fine-grained understanding of this problem, we need to go a step further. So I think this problem is probably largely caused by this imbalance of token frequency in language modeling. Because if you have a balanced classification problem like the left-hand side figure, in your embedding space, it should be the case that embeddings of different inputs are sort of evenly distributed in this space already. But for language modeling, the embedding space usually looks like the right-hand side figure, where only a very few data points are around the 0 point, but the vast majority of the data points are at the edge of the embedding space, and only a very narrow cone in that whole embedding space. So I think, so this Gao et al. ICLEAR 2019 paper said that it's because during language modeling, the most tokens are sampled as negative examples, that they are the denominator in the log likelihood computation, if you think, because most words in natural language is actually rare words. And the words we frequently talk about will be only restricted to a very small set. And this long tail distribution resulted in that the most informative words, the words that actually represent the most meaning, actually are sampled quite rarely as a positive example in language modeling, but mostly as a negative, and receive negative gradients when doing language modeling. And if all these rare words receive negative gradients all the time, and these gradients will be of similar direction, they will get pushed into a narrow corner in that embedding space, which resulted in the performance, catastrophic performance in this kind of off-the-shelf embedding-based tasks. So we think that essentially our method has redistributed these data points to a more even space in the embeddings. So in the similarity task, like sentence similarity, the performance gets boosted a lot. And there is another piece of evidence from Yan et al. ACO 2021. What they did was, when they compute sentence embeddings, they simply removed the most frequent tokens embeddings when they computed the average. If you look at the red box, if they remove around 10%, the top 10 most frequent tokens when computing the mean pooling of the embeddings, the performance of the model suddenly jumped from 55 to around 60 or above 60. So that sort of verified the idea that those frequent tokens in the center actually dominated the computation of meaning in these cases. And if you simply remove those tokens on the narrow column side will be more dominant when computing the mean average of the embeddings. And the model becomes more sensitive towards those tokens. And in the end, the model performs also better. And we also have the understanding that we think this kind of contrastive learning is not gaining sort of too much new knowledge from the text. And it's a similar perspective to the works we've just talked about. We think that it's more sort of a post-adjustment of the embedding of the BERT model. Because in computer vision, you can train a very good image encoder from scratch using self-supervised learning. I think we think it's not the case for text modeling. We think it's during BERT pre-training, the model stored a lot of knowledge, but it's probably embedded in the intermediate layers or somehow compositionally in all the layers, but not very clearly presented in one single layer. And we need to apply this kind of post-adjustment contrastive training to actually rewire those knowledge out to the correct position. So in this experiment, what we did is we tried more training data sampled. So in our experiments, we used only 10K actually achieved already very good performance. But we noticed that even if we increase the number of training examples, in this case, we increased to up to 100K data points. The model's performance didn't increase, but plateaued after around 20K. So we think that this sort of suggests that the model is overfitting to the task because this is sort of an easy task, and it's not gaining new knowledge anymore during the training process. Yeah. Another interesting experiment we did to verify this is that we just randomly generated some strings instead of sample sentences from real data. And we applied contrastive learning on these randomly generated sequences and still observed the very good improvement based on BERT. This kind of zero semantics random string tuning really tells us that the model is rewiring its existing knowledge to the correct position instead of gaining any new knowledge from the text, because in this case, there is no new knowledge at all. Yeah, that's sort of everything about the first work. I'm a little bit behind my schedule, so I will accelerate a bit. Our code and models are all released, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there is a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Let me read. Did you experiment on mirror BERT with other NLP augmentations, back translation, synonym replacement, random insertion, under sentences, Gaussian noise injection, and the word embedding? I am not an NLP expert, so I don't know if these augmentations are used in practice. Also, I don't know which augmentations BERT is pre-trained with, but would it benefit from the augmentations you present? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, that's a very fundamental question. I did try a bunch of things because when I started this work, I thought I was going to do a work like that, like computer vision. You have all sort of data augmentations, and if you use them together, it will perform better. The reason that it's ended up with just a very simple data augmentation is because everything else didn't work as well. It's very frustratingly true that in this case, the simplest thing works the best. I think it's because since what we have here is a sort of post-adjustment, we were sort of not expecting the model to learn any new knowledge. So for synonym replacement, for example, you are sort of injecting some knowledge to the model, and you hopefully the model could remember that. But if the purpose is simply extract whatever knowledge there is in BERT, something as simple as what we have here, it would be sufficient. But I think it will be really interesting open question for the future that how can we make this kind of very like a sophisticated contrastive learning to work for NLP, because I didn't manage to. I think when I tried things like not back translations I didn't try, but for things like synonym replacement, the model suffers from the problem that it overfits really quickly. Because if you just replace a synonym within a random mini batch, the positive pairs are still quite similar comparing to their similarity with randomly sampled sentences. So I guess you probably could construct some very kind of adversarial negatives to make the contrastive learning work. I've seen a couple of works from the community trying to do this on arXiv. So yeah, it will be really interesting future exploration directions. I will jump to the next work, and I hope that answered your question. And yeah, the second work is called Transencoder, unsupervised sentence pair modeling through self and mutual distillations. It's joint work with Minglong, Jordan, Emine, and Seki when I was an intern at Amazon last year. So to understand transencoder, there are some prerequisites needed, which are the concept of bi or dual encoder and cross encoder. So bi or dual encoder will be the model we talked about prior to this work. Cross encoder will be a different architecture, which is shown here. So in bi-encoder, given a sentence pair, we input those two sentences separately to the model, and we get two embeddings. We compute their similarity in the embedding space. That's pretty straightforward. But in cross-encoder, differently, we concatenate the two sequences, input to the model at once, and we get an embedding. Then we apply a dimension reduction layer to map that embedding to a similarity score between the two sequences. You could probably already guess the pros and cons of these two architectures. So according to Sakura et al. NACO 2021, cross-encoder performance is much, much greater than bi-encoder given the same amount of supervision. If you see their figure, given the same training data, cross-encoder would usually outperform bi-encoder by 10%. But bi-encoder has its own benefit. For example, speed. Bi-encoder is much faster than cross-encoder. If you wanted to compute the pairwise similarity of n documents, you can just compute n document embeddings and compare the similarities post hoc with matrix multiplication. That's much quicker than computing pairwise similarities of documents for cross-encoder. If you want to perform tasks like clustering, this will be one order of larger complexity, which would be really bad for cross-encoder architecture. And another benefit of bi-encoder is it can be trained in a completely unsupervised way, as we introduced previous to this work. The Mirabird work is a good example of unsupervised bi-encoder learning. For cross-encoder, up to this point, I haven't seen other works that proposed an unsupervised cross-encoder. The main reason is that you have to get just one, and you only have one embedding after the encoding process, and you don't have this embedding space where you can actually compare different sequences. With one embedding, you have to apply a dimension reduction layer, which have to be trained somehow. So we propose transencoder, and we hope that it's a combination of both models, because we see benefits from both models. Here, let's just revisit the pros and cons here very briefly. Bi-encoder performs worse, but it's faster and can be trained unsupervisedly. Cross-encoder performs really a lot better, but it's really slow and it cannot be trained completely unsupervised. So we will propose a model that can train a cross-encoder in a completely unsupervised way. The idea is that we will use bi-encoder, which is trained in a supervised way to generate data for the cross-encoder to learn. And the supervised learned cross-encoder would actually outperform bi-encoder. And after getting a better cross-encoder, we will use the cross-encoder to further label training data to distill the knowledge back to the bi-encoder. So after completing this loop, the bi-encoder would actually surpass its previous iteration performance, and we have formed a cycle of knowledge distillation. But this is just a very brief figure. I will introduce every step in the following slides very, very carefully. So the first step, as I mentioned, would be converting a Persian language model into a very good unsupervised bi-encoder, because off-the-shelf Persian language models are really bad. They don't work for sentence similarity. So what we wanted to do is we first bootstrap the Persian language model's performance on sentence similarity for free with existing methods like Mirrorbird and SimCSE. After having this relatively strong bi-encoder, we sampled sentence pairs which are unlabeled. We used the bi-encoder to give similarity scores to the unlabeled sentence pairs. Then we get a data set, we call it a silver data set, with pairs of sentences and their similarities. So with this data set at hand, we can train a cross-encoder in a supervised manner. And after training this cross-encoder in a supervised manner, we use it to label even more data. And notice that actually we used the same set of unlabeled sentence pairs as the bi-encoder. It's just that we disregarded their training labels and replaced it with the cross-encoder's predictions. And the bi-encoder will learn from this set of new data, and the iteration goes on and on. Hopefully, bi-encoder and cross-encoder can mutually bootstrap performance of each other. And that's our transencoder architecture, as simple as that. What's worth mentioning is the loss function being used here. So for bi to cross-encoder distillation, we use the binary cross-entropy loss, while for cross to bi-encoder knowledge distillation, we use the mean square errors. The reason is that there is a less of a risk for overfitting when distilling knowledge from cross to bi-encoders, because in bi-encoder you are encoding two sequences separately, and there is no inter-sentence interaction happening when you encode the two sequences. So the model naturally becomes less possible to overfit to the data. But if you imagine the case of distilling knowledge from bi to cross-encoder, the cross-encoder has access to both sequences in just one model. If you use mean square error here, chances are that the cross-encoder would overfit to the scores generated by the bi-encoder. If it numerically completely overfits to the pseudo scores, the two models essentially collapse into just one model. And we don't want that to happen. So we use the binary cross entropy here. According to our gradient analysis, it's just a sigmoid scaled version of mean square error. We actually also have a mutual distillation extension, which means you apply self-distillation in parallel for two different Persian language models. This is a really simple idea to smooth out the noise stored in the original Persian language model. Because if your original Persian language model is really bad, the noise will be propagated all the way in the encoding process. So this mutual distillation thing is mainly to just conduct parallel learning between different Persian language models, and they will smooth out the noise of each other, hopefully. And we found this empirically works really well, but I will skip the details of this for the sake of time. let's just go straight ahead to look at our experimental results. It's really, really good, I must admit. It's yeah, before that, let me talk about the tasks we look at. The first is semantic textual similarity, which is sentence similarity I mentioned before. Given two sentences, the model needs to judge their similarity. And we also experimented with a set of binary classification tasks where it's either for question deduplication or question answer entailment, where the model needs to judge whether the answer actually answered the question, or it's the third task is MRPC, which is Microsoft Research Paraphrase Corpus. Given sentence one, sentence two, the model needs to judge whether the two sentences are paraphrases of each other. We first tested on STS, and our model seems to have achieved a state-of-the-art on the benchmark. As you can see, based on the previous unsupervised bi-encoder state-of-the-art, transencoder can achieve up to 5% of the improvement on STS. This is quite significant on this benchmark. And for binary classification tasks, we have achieved a similar amount of improvement, ranging from 3% to 6%. And more interestingly, we tried this domains transfer setup where we trained our model on sentence pairs sampled from STS, but directly tested our model on binary classification tasks. This is just to make sure that the model doesn't overfit to the task, but is properly generalizing to unseen tasks and domains. And it turns out that for cross-encoders, it's generalizing really, really well. But for bi-encoders, the model is less consistent. I think that's quite interpretable because cross-encoder essentially learned the capability of looking at similar tokens of different sequences. So this kind of capability of looking at similar tokens across two sequences is really universal for any sentence pair modeling task. I think that's why the model generalized really well. But for dual encoders, it's more domain specific, I think. And usually it's the case that you need to sample some in-domain data for training. Otherwise, the model would suffer from a shift of domain. Yeah, that's the transferability I mentioned just now. The red boxes are the performance of cross-encoder, and the blue boxes are performance change of the bi-encoders. Our models and code are all open source. Feel free to check them out, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you. That'll be everything.
But thank you, Fangyu, for such a nice and clear talk, full of really insightful.
Thank you.
If anyone has a question now, feel free to speak now, or if not, I'm sure Fangyu will be happy to answer questions offline. I will share on the chat his Twitter handle in case anyone wants to follow him and ping him with other questions.
Yeah, so feel free to shoot me an email or DM me on Twitter if you have any questions, and or if you want to chat about one of these two works.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, then we can wrap up. Thank you again. Thank you. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening to the talk. Yeah, I hope to see you sometime in the future.
Sure thing.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.